If you look at the news industry, I just think that trust is becoming more and more critical in a sea of information, misinformation.
My guest is a communications expert and research associate at the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism.
The world needs journalism. It needs impartial journalism that holds businesses to account, holds politicians to account.
He's passionately writing, speaking, and commenting on how technology is affecting journalism.
What I've learned is to listen a lot more. That's one I've definitely carried forward, is to try to do more listening and less talking.
My name is Alexander. I'm part of the People and Culture team at Greiner.
Greiner Talks. We talk transformation. Listen in and get inspired.
Welcome, Nic Newman.
Thanks very much. Great to be here.
Nic, that was quite a hike up here, but we are rewarded with a beautiful view.
Amazing, absolutely amazing peaks. And, this morning was crystal clear and we're getting a few clouds in. So I'm seeing it in all of its glory, all the seasons in one day.
We are here in Alpbach, a tiny mountain village in the Austrian Alps, at an event called the European Forum Alpbach. How would you describe that event, this place, to someone who has never been here before?
Well, I'm still getting to know it, but it's an extraordinary event. So it's a sort of gathering of young people talking about the big issues facing the world around trust, climate change, around politics, and around media and trust. We live in these very divisive, polarized times, and this kind of event really helps try and bring some solutions, bring things together in new ways.
Bringing people together, I think that's really the perfect place for this. Also for speaking about trust, about media, about communications with you today. And I would like to start with an infamous old statement. Bad news is good news is no news. Is that still true, or has it ever been true?
Like so many of these things, there's a lot of truth in it. So if you look at how people consume news, they are drawn to the big conflicts. They're drawn into the shocking events, the things they didn't know about. But there's much more to news than that. And if you purely gorge yourself on bad news, you end up feeling very hollow. And so, in the news industry, we talk about different kinds of user needs, updating people on difficult stories, holding people to account. Those things are important, but also giving people light, giving people hope, and giving people context and understanding. And those are things that the news industry is thinking about a lot right now, is how we can improve that sort of range of user needs to engage people, attract people.
And what would you say is the ratio between good news, bad news in average media today?
Well, the criticism from ordinary people is there's too much bad news and too much negative news. And, that's partly just the nature of the news agenda these days. It's been one thing after another with COVID, cost of living crisis, wars in Ukraine, wars in the Middle East. So the news is quite depressing. But on the other hand, there's lots of positive things happening around climate change, how technology is changing things. There's a lot of important issues that aren't really about good news or bad news. They're just about progress or how people feel about different things. So I think the challenge, and in traditional media, you used to have a package, it might be a newspaper or television news bulletin, and you would have the opportunity as an editor to provide that mix. And with digital media, as you scroll through social media, people talk about doom scrolling. It's one bad thing after another. And that is kind of putting people off the news. In our data, we find across 47 countries that we survey, around 4 in 10 said that they are actively avoiding news these days. So they're interested in news, they're consuming news, but they're also avoiding it a lot of the time. And that's a real worry, I think, for society and for media companies.
Working in the broader field of sustainability and thinking of the climate crisis, of biodiversity challenges, of wars going on in many countries around the world, to me it seems that we are urgently in need of actual solutions, of progress, and probably also in need of more positive stories, more positive developments. Shouldn't media highlight these developments even stronger?
Again, it goes back to incentives and what sells to some extent. So, there is a movement towards more constructive journalism, solutions journalism. These are all phrases that people are bandying about, and they have particular techniques. So instead of always talking about the worst crime figures, for example, you look at an area where crime figures have improved and you try and understand why they've improved and how that could be applied in other ways. So that's the idea of solutions journalism. Slow journalism is just breaking away from the now, from what's happening right now, the sort of immediate facts that you've probably forgotten the next day, and trying to talk about the real big issues. Okay, how do we solve climate change? What are some of the deeper issues that we don't talk about in daily discourse? And we're also seeing, as well as media companies trying to do that, we are seeing sort of more positive news. For example, in TikTok, you have ordinary people. There's a climate sustainability scientist called Elena Wood who runs a TikTok account, which is very successful. And it's a roundup of sort of good news stories that are also news. You know, they are things that are positive. And that kind of thing really resonates with some people, particularly with young people. So younger people really, in our data, are more likely to respond to positive news that's giving them hope in some way.
I remember a statement from a very successful human rights defender, and she once said that she's not only reading newspapers that are aligned with her worldview and that she trusts in, but she's on purpose reading newspapers that she thinks are poorly researched, that she's not trusting, but she wants to know the different views, the different opinions. What do you think about that strategy?
I think a lot of people say that. Not many people do it. So I think we all like to think that we're not in a filter bubble, that we're basically trying to expose ourselves to a range of views. And we do talk to people in interviews where, you know, we ask them about their media consumption habits, and they say that they deliberately go and look at the views of the opposing side, so they know how to formulate arguments in these divisive discussions. But it's also easy just to get drawn into groups of people who think like you, either in social media or actually that's always been the case. You know, I grew up in a small part of the country and almost everybody that I knew had the same views, read the same newspapers. So this is not new. The idea of filter bubbles is something that's been going on for some time, and we need to definitely break away from them if we're going to solve some of these really intractable issues.
So you're already mentioning the term filter bubbles because a lot of information we see, particularly online, is kind of tailored to what we already like or what we agree to. And this can limit our exposure to different viewpoints. Do you think that they really have the power to shape our worldviews, to shape our opinion?
I think the evidence is not clear that filter bubbles or social media bubbles are as influential as people think. If you look at the data, only a small percentage of people only get their news from social media, for example. So normally you are exposing yourself to television news or things that your friends or colleagues say. So there's a range of things that you get. On the other hand, the algorithms, or many of the algorithms, are pushing you towards things that you already like for financial gain for a lot of those companies, you know, to get more engagement. But there are also algorithms that don't do that really are programmed for serendipity and for learning new things. So if you're thinking about music, something like Spotify's Discover algorithm is all about discovering new things. And that's also commercially valuable to them. And I think we haven't spent enough time sort of thinking about different kinds of algorithms. So many of the algorithms are the TikTok algorithm, which give you the same of what you've already watched. And I think people will tire of that, and people are already tiring of that.
We are already diving into technology. I think that's another huge issue that's also being discussed here in Alpbach, and that's very closely linked to fake news, at least to my understanding. Feels like it's getting harder and harder to identify whether information is valid and correct or whether it is not. Do you have any advice on how to identify to avoid fake news?
Well, I mean, firstly, just the data. What you say at an aggregate level across all the countries we look at is true. People are more worried about it, more concerned about it than they were. So the question we ask is, to what extent do you worry that you can't tell what's true and fake on the internet when it comes to news? And that number's over 60% of people are concerned about that. And it's increased for the last 2 years significantly. And I think something like artificial intelligence, AI, is only going to make that worse. So, you know, increasingly we're seeing synthetic content being produced in social media. It's not clear what's true and what isn't, who produced it. Pictures that were clearly fabricated a year ago are increasingly photorealistic. So it's increasingly hard to tell because of the advances in technology. The other thing is that fake news, or so-called fake news, really, you've got to divide into different things. So some things are factually wrong, and so you can correct those things. You can put out alternative information around those things. But a lot of fake news, or what people think of as fake news, is really just opinion that you don't like. And what we've seen is just sort of huge range of perspectives and opinion that previously wouldn't have found space in mainstream media within social media. And so that raises much bigger issues around free speech and where the line in free speech should be. So fake news is a very complicated, difficult issue because it very much depends where you're coming from as to what you think is fake news.
Still, any practical advice on how to identify, avoid it?
I think in terms of just straight facts, for example, when there's a mass shooting or a stabbing or a terrorist incident, is just to be really, really careful, to focus on sources that are reliable, ideally to check several sources. And when it comes to the issue of opinion, it's about just checking different sources, as we were talking about earlier, not just to look at one source, but to look at how other people are seeing the same issues. So I think a lot of it's around digital literacy and common sense in many ways.
And for me, that's also very closely linked to greenwashing, actually, because there's hardly any multinational corporation that doesn't talk about sustainability and sustainability targets. As a journalist, how do you distinguish honest ambition from greenwashing? Do you have any advice or any insights here?
I mean, it's very similar to the way you would interrogate other kinds of information that is put out there by a corporation, which is to be skeptical. It's also, I think, increasingly knowing your subject, so having a lot of deep knowledge so you can challenge things, to ask the follow-up questions, not just take the claims at face value. We actually run a network of journalists around climate and the environment at Oxford University, and some of the things we encourage them to do is to look at that sort of positive imagery and really question it, look out for very vague claims and interrogate those vague claims, and to really build up expertise so that you instinctively know when claims are being made that are false or aren't backed up by the evidence.
Do you feel that the landscape is changing here, that companies are becoming more cautious about these things?
Over time, companies have been caught out by overclaiming. And so I think they recognize that such is the scrutiny now, not just from journalists, but from social media as well, that they need to be able to back up claims. And they can't get away anymore with just sort of generalized vague claims around what they're doing for the environment, because people will follow it up. So I think it's all about honesty, transparency, doing what you say, walking the talk, all of that.
And as a producer of plastics and foam, Greiner operates in an environment that is, of course, very challenging, and it demands us to transform, actually. What advice do you have for our leadership team and particularly for our corporate communications team when it comes to sustainability communications?
Yeah, so I'm not an expert in this area, but I think obviously, and I think this is true of all communication, being transparent. If you have targets, what do those targets actually mean? So beneath the sort of headlines, telling stories around it, again, which are authentic and true, having a very clear plan and strategy of how you're going to change the business over time and making sure that all your communications is in line with that plan. And doing what you say. I mean, that's what trust is fundamentally about. It's about building relationships and being true to what you say.
A big part of this event here was talking and discussing about trust. So I'd like to know from you, what does trust mean to you personally?
To me, it's about building a personal track record, doing what you say, doing it with integrity. And I think it's important because it helps you to get to where you want to go more quickly. You can make a lot of shortcuts if people trust you personally, and you don't need to ask so many questions. So trust is kind of important just in terms of, speed of decisions, which I think are important. So that's what it means to me personally. If you look at the news industry, trust is becoming more and more critical in a sea of information, misinformation, abundant media, opinions, perspectives coming out of everywhere 24 hours a day. Having those shortcuts, having those relationships that you can just say, okay, it comes from this particular source, so I can take that on trust and I can build on that, I think is going to be increasingly important.
You have a very impressive track record in your career. I know that you have been leading, or that you have been part of bringing the very first BBC website to life, if I'm correct.
Yeah. Yes, in 1997, so a long time ago now. Yeah.
So I'm very curious to know, what is one of the major learnings of your career? What advice would you give somebody working in communications?
What I've learned is to listen a lot more. So I think journalists are very good at talking and asking questions, but not so good at listening. And I realized that when I moved so I spent 5 years running the editorial side of BBC News Online when we started, and then around technology and product teams. And I thought that what we did was we listened to audiences, but we often didn't. We just decided on a hunch what we were going to build and what audiences wanted. And then it turned out that they didn't like what we did. And there was, a particular product failure which really turned around my thinking about the way in which we needed to develop products in different ways, to really listen to audiences before you start the process, to make sure you really understand those core needs, and then to bring your creativity to that problem that has been crystallized by audiences. That's one I've definitely carried forward, is to try to do more listening and less talking.
Having a lot of experience in the media industry, what is your vision for the future of journalism?
It's challenging. I think from a business point of view, it's challenging. From a trust point of view, from an engagement point of view right now, as I mentioned, people are avoiding the news. I think there's a massive problem of the product and the relevance of the product and the way that it engages people with the issues that they really care about. And I think a lot of that goes back to trying to listen more closely and trying to close that gap between what audiences expect in terms of agendas, formats, tone, particularly young audiences, really struggling to get to young audiences. But I'm also optimistic. I think the world needs journalism. It needs impartial journalism that holds businesses to account, holds politicians to account, and we can solve the funding problems over time.
Nic, there's a lot of things that I would still like to discuss with you, but we are slowly coming to an end of this episode. But before I let you go, I would love to invite you to wrap it up with me.
Greiner Talks. Let's wrap it up. I get inspired by
young people.
We need to start
learning and listening.
Let's talk about
the future.
What I wish for
is more understanding between groups that are currently divided.
Your message to the world.
Keep smiling, keep positive.
I like that very, very positive, uplifting end of this conversation. So thank you very much for coming here and for taking your time.
Thanks, Alexander.
And thank you everyone for listening. Check out Nic Newman online and have a lovely day.
Visit Greiner.com. Share your thoughts and let us know who you think should be our next guest. Greiner Talks. Subscribe now.